In the late 19 teens, with other naval powers like the Royal Navy, Imperial Japanese Navy, and the French Navy, all experimenting with aircraft carriers to some degree, the United States needed to produce an aircraft carrier as well. So they looked to convert an already existing ship like the Royal Navy or the French Navy, but did not have battleship or battlecruiser hulls to use like them. So the US designers went with something smaller and quite different, a cargo ship, or more specifically, a fleet collier, which is a ship built to carry a large amount of coal, which makes quite a bit of sense seeing how the ship already had quite a lot of space to carry aircraft and equipment, along with anything else needed to experiment with the rather new concepts of ships with the purpose to carry, launch, and hopefully recover aircraft. Langley was an experiment to test the validity of this concept. The ship started off life as USS Jupiter, a collier built for the US Navy, with the distinction of being the first turboelectric ship in the United States Navy. Jupiter would have a standard displacement of 19,360 tons, would have a top speed of around 14 knots, with its twin turbo electric motors. She would be laid down in 1911, launched in 1912, and commissioned in 1913. The purpose for Jupiter and her sister ships were to support the growing US fleet and expand their range by supplying the coal the ships would need to go long distances like across the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans. She would commission and be stationed on the Pacific coast of the United States until October 10th of 1914, where she used the newly built Panama Canal to move from the Pacific to the Atlantic and made her way to Philadelphia. Prior to World War I, she would be attached to the Auxiliary Division of the Atlantic Fleet and cruise in the Gulf of Mexico. When the United States joined the war, she would be assigned to the Naval Overseas Transport Service. She would transport coal as well as transporting soldiers from the United States to the European theater. Foreshadowing her future career as Langley, she would transport a naval aviation detachment to England. After the war, she would first stop off in Norfolk in August of 1919, where she was transferred to the West Coast, but recalled because their conversion to an aircraft carrier had been improved. Being a collier made her pretty well suited for the task of conversion to an aircraft carrier, with its large hold for coal which could easily be adapted into a hangar. Although the main hangar was an open-air one below the main deck, and having a new flight deck that was built on the top part of the ship. The ship would have one elevator and one catapult. Another feature that was similar to contemporaries like the Japanese Hosho, her bridge would be put at the front of the ship. Her weight was greatly reduced, being only about 12,900 tons standard displacement and 14,000 tons full load. With her 3 boilers and her turbo-electric motors, she would drive 2 shafts, producing around 7,200 shaft horsepower, giving her a top speed of 15.5 knots. Now, her armament consisted of 4 5-inch or 127mm guns, and her aircraft complement was about 36. Due to public apprehension about the new warship construction and the ambiguity of the unsigned Washington Naval Treaty, she would not be recommissioned until 1922, with the Washington Naval Treaty providing for experimental aircraft carriers like Langley. In October of 1922, Langley would launch her first aircraft from her deck, although not the first time in the world that a plane launched from an aircraft carrier. It was the first time for the United States Navy, which meant the dawn of the carrier was born for the United States Navy. Langley would spend 1923 doing public exhibitions and fleet exercises, with much of the same from 1924, except spending the summer in Norfolk to do repairs and alterations, and then transferring to the West Coast to join the Pacific Battle Fleet in San Diego. By 1927, Langley would have a regular schedule of operating from Guantanamo Bay Naval Base and alternating between there and Hawaii for fleet exercises, which would be her career until 1936. Now, it's important to note that throughout this time and up until 1942, Langley would carry some of the most modern planes of the US Navy, where she would do her intended job of experimenting with takeoff from the deck of an aircraft carrier. In 1936, Langley would see yet another conversion, this time to a seaplane tender, because the United States Navy felt that she had done her intended job of experimenting and training future US Navy pilots for carrier operations, and with much larger carriers now in full swing for the Navy and across the world, she wouldn't be really useful as a fleet carrier anymore. But what the US Navy did need were more ships that could support their large fleets of long-range float planes, and already being well suited to handle aircraft, it seemed like a perfect fit. So her deck was reduced, with about the front third being now open. The conversion was done in early 1937. She emerged no longer as CV-1, but AV-3. She served in the Aircraft Scouting Force, operating from Seattle, Washington, Sitka, Alaska, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and San Diego, California. She would rejoin the Atlantic Fleet in February of 1939 for a short stint until July of 1939, in which she would return to the Pacific Fleet, where she headed off to Manila in the Philippines, being there when the Second World War broke out. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Langley was anchored off Cavite in the Philippines, and quickly departed for the Dutch East Indies to avoid the oncoming Japanese advance. But that too quickly became unsafe with the successful Japanese operations in the area. Her next goal was to reach Australia, where she would reach Darwin in Australia by the 1st of January 1941, in which she was enlisted in the Provisional Composite Force of British, Dutch, Australian, and American forces in the area, known as ABDA Command, and for 10 days she assisted the Royal Australian Air Force in anti-submarine patrols. Then she was enlisted into carrying Allied aircraft to Southeast Asia, where she and other ships would carry fighters to Java in the Dutch East Indies. She departed on the 22nd of February, where she joined up with a convoy, and en route, Langley and several other ships were directed to another part of Java to deliver those planes. Early on the 27th of February, Langley rendezvoused with U.S. destroyers, and by 11:40 that morning, the group was spotted by a Japanese aircraft. The Japanese sent 16 Mitsubishi G4M bombers flying out of Bali. The bombers did not release their entire payload at once, and instead released partial payloads since they were level bombing from a medium altitude. Because of this, Langley was able to avoid the first and second bombing passes, but the bombers changed their tactics, and as a result, Langley took 5 hits from a mix of 250 and 60 kilogram bombs, as well as damage from 3 near misses. The topside of the ship was in flames, unable to steer, and with the ship developing a 10-degree list to port. Langley was not looking good. She was officially dead in the water when her engine room flooded, and at 1:32 in the afternoon of February 27, 1942, the order was given to abandon ship, and thus ended the career of the first United States aircraft carrier. Langley was a very important ship for the United States naval development. Being the first aircraft carrier in the fleet, she would be the testbed for many new inventive ideas, and for experimentation of new aircraft that would help to better the U.S. Navy and allow for future successes seen in the later parts of the Second World War, due to the training and lessons learned from her experimental nature. However, due to the difficult situation in the early period of the war in the Pacific the Allies faced, Langley was needed to help bring fighters to the Dutch East Indies, but was unfortunately sunk, and now this vital piece of U.S. naval aviation history is lost to us.